Today's video is about Greek mythology, the battles between Apollo, the radiant god of music and prophecy, and Python, the monstrous serpent that terrorized the ancient world. We'll discover the dramatic circumstances of Apollo's birth, and how the jealous rage of Hera set the stage for everything that followed. Then we'll explore the terrifying reign of Python, the massive serpent that guarded the sacred oracle of Delphi and struck fear into the hearts of mortals and gods alike. Furthermore, we'll witness the young Apollo's quest for vengeance and glory as he seeks to establish his own divine domain. Additionally, we'll experience the earth-shaking battle itself, where divine arrows meet serpentine fury in a clash that would reshape the mythological landscape forever. Finally, we'll uncover how this victory transformed Apollo from a young deity into one of the most revered gods of the Greek pantheon, and how it established the famous Oracle of Delphi that would guide heroes and kings for centuries to come. Our story begins not with the battle itself, but with the circumstances that made it inevitable. Picture, if you will, the ancient world when the gods still walked among mortals, when Mount Olympus buzzed with divine politics and petty jealousies that could reshape the very fabric of reality. Zeus, the king of the gods, had done what Zeus did best. He had fallen in love with a mortal woman. This time it was Leto, a titaness of extraordinary beauty, whose very presence seemed to make the stars shine brighter. However, as was often the case with Zeus's romantic adventures, his wife Hera discovered the affair, and her divine wrath knew no bounds. Consequently, Hera's jealousy manifested in the cruelest way imaginable. She forbade any land on earth from giving shelter to the pregnant Leto, condemning her to wander endlessly across the world as her time drew near. The Titaness traveled from kingdom to kingdom, from island to island, but everywhere she went, the people turned her away in fear of Hera's terrible vengeance. Meanwhile, Leto's condition grew more desperate with each passing day. The divine children within her womb, for she carried twins, seemed to sense their mother's distress. The very earth trembled beneath her feet as she searched for a place to give birth, and the sky above grew dark with ominous clouds that reflected Hera's ongoing fury. It was then that Leto remembered the floating island of Delos, a piece of land so unstable and insignificant that it had been forgotten by most of the world. Since Delos was not technically fixed to the earth, it existed outside of Hera's decree. Desperate and exhausted, Leto made her way to this humble refuge, and there, after 9 days and nights of labor, she gave birth to her divine children. First came Artemis, the future goddess of the hunt, born beneath a palm tree as the island shook with divine energy. Then, after helping her mother through the rest of the labor, Artemis assisted in the delivery of her twin brother. As the sun rose on the 10th day, Apollo entered the world with a cry that echoed across the heavens themselves. But what made this birth even more remarkable was what happened next. According to the ancient poets, Apollo spoke his first words, while still a newborn, declaring his future domains with a voice that rang with divine authority. "Mine shall be the lyre and the bow," he proclaimed, "and I shall reveal to mankind the unerring will of Zeus." Nevertheless, even as Apollo announced his destiny, the shadow of Hera's hatred still loomed over the family. The queen of the gods had not finished with her revenge, and her next move would create the very monster that Apollo would one day face in battle. Now, while Apollo grew in strength and wisdom on the island of Delos, a terrible creature was making its presence known in the sacred valley of Delphi. This was Python, a serpent of such enormous size and malevolent power that it defied mortal comprehension. Python was not merely a large snake, it was a primordial force of chaos, born from the very earth itself in the earliest days of creation. Some say it emerged from the mud left behind after the great flood that Zeus had sent to cleanse the world of the Bronze Age of humanity. Others claim it was one of the children of Gaia, the Earth Mother, created to guard the sacred oracle that had existed at Delphi since time immemorial. Regardless of its origin, Python's presence transformed the beautiful valley of Delphi into a place of terror. The serpent's body was said to be so massive that it could coil around entire mountains, its scales gleaming like polished bronze in the sunlight. Its eyes burned with an inner fire that could drive mortals mad with fear, and its breath was so poisonous that it could wither crops and poison rivers for miles around. Moreover, Python possessed an intelligence that made it even more dangerous than its physical attributes suggested. It could speak in ancient tongues, weaving prophecies and curses with equal skill. The serpent had claimed the Oracle of Delphi as its own, using the sacred site to spread its influence across the known world. The oracle itself was a marvel of the ancient world, a deep chasm in the earth from which rose vapors that could induce prophetic visions. Before Python's arrival, the oracle had been tended by the Titaness Themis, who used its power to deliver just and fair prophecies to those who sought guidance. But under Python's dominion, the oracle became a source of fear and manipulation. The serpent would allow certain mortals to approach the oracle, but only those who brought sufficient tribute or who served its dark purposes. Python's prophecies were often cryptic and cruel, designed to cause more harm than good. Kings and heroes who dared to consult the oracle found themselves trapped in webs of fate that led to their ruin. Furthermore, Python's influence extended far beyond the immediate area around Delphi. The serpent commanded lesser monsters and dark spirits, creating a network of terror that stretched across central Greece. Travelers spoke in hushed whispers of the screams that echoed from the valley at night, and of the strange lights that danced above the oracle's chasm when Python communed with the darker forces of the underworld. The local population lived in constant fear. Shepherds found their flocks dead, drained of life by the serpent's poisonous presence. Farmers watched their crops wither and die, and even the bravest warriors refused to venture near the sacred valley. The few who did return told tales of horror, of Python's massive form rising from the depths of the chasm, its voice speaking prophecies of doom in languages that predated human civilization. Yet for all its power and terror, Python had made one crucial mistake. In its arrogance, the serpent had claimed dominion over a site that was destined to belong to another. The fates themselves had decreed that Delphi would one day become the seat of the most important oracle in the Greek world, and that oracle would serve not chaos and fear, but truth and divine justice. As Python terrorized the valleys of central Greece, Apollo was growing into his divine nature on the island of Delos. The young god's development was unlike anything the world had ever seen, for he matured not just in body, but in power and wisdom, at a rate that amazed even the other Olympians. Within his first year, Apollo had already mastered the gifts he had proclaimed at birth. His skill with the lyre was so extraordinary that the very stones would weep when he played, and wild animals would gather to listen to his melodies. His archery was equally impressive. He could split an arrow in flight and hit targets that existed only in the realm of possibility. But it was Apollo's connection to prophecy and divine truth that truly set him apart. Even as a young god, he possessed an uncanny ability to see through deception and to understand the deeper meanings behind events. This gift would prove crucial in the challenges that lay ahead. During these early years, Apollo's mother Leto often told him stories of the world beyond Delos. She spoke of the sacred places where the gods were worshipped, of the oracles that guided mortal destiny, and of the ancient sites of power that dotted the Greek landscape. It was during one of these conversations that Leto first mentioned Delphi and the terrible serpent that had claimed it. Once, Leto explained to her son, as they sat beneath the palm tree where he had been born, Delphi was the most beautiful valley in all of Greece. The oracle there was pure and true, serving justice and wisdom rather than fear and chaos. But now, Python has twisted it into something dark and terrible. Apollo listened intently, his young mind already beginning to form the plans that would shape his destiny. "Tell me more about this serpent, Mother," he requested, his voice carrying a note of steel that seemed strange, coming from one so young. Leto hesitated, sensing the dangerous direction of her son's thoughts. "Python is not merely a monster, my son. It is a force of primordial chaos, older than the Olympians themselves. Its power is rooted in the very foundations of the earth. However, rather than deterring Apollo, this information only strengthened his resolve. Then it is time for the old chaos to give way to the new order," he replied. "The world needs oracles that serve truth and justice, not fear and manipulation." As Apollo grew older, his divine nature began to manifest in new ways. He developed an innate understanding of harmony and order, seeing how all things should fit together in perfect balance. This cosmic perspective made Python's corruption of Delphi even more offensive to him. The serpent wasn't just terrorizing mortals, it was disrupting the natural order of the universe itself. Meanwhile, stories of Python's cruelties continued to reach Delos. Travelers spoke of entire cities that had been abandoned after the serpent's influence reached them. Heroes who had tried to challenge Python were found transformed into stone statues, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The very land around Delphi was said to be cursed, where nothing pure or beautiful could survive. These tales filled Apollo with a righteous anger that grew stronger with each passing day. He began to practice his archery with renewed intensity, crafting arrows that gleamed with divine light. He studied the ancient arts of prophecy and divination, preparing himself for the day when he would need to understand the deepest mysteries of fate and destiny. Furthermore, Apollo began to seek out the wisdom of the older gods. He spoke with his grandfather, the Titan Kronos, learning about the ancient powers that had shaped the world. He consulted with the fates themselves, trying to understand his role in the cosmic order. Each conversation confirmed what he already knew in his heart. His destiny was tied to Delphi, and the confrontation with Python was inevitable. The young god also began to gather allies for the battle he knew was coming. His twin sister Artemis pledged her support, as did several of the other Olympians who had grown tired of Python's influence. Even some of the older, more cautious gods began to see the wisdom in Apollo's quest, recognizing that the serpent's corruption threatened the very balance of the world. Yet, despite all his preparation and growing power, Apollo knew that the battle with Python would test him in ways he had never been tested before. The serpent had ruled Delphi for centuries, drawing power from the sacred earth itself. It had faced heroes and monsters alike and had never been defeated. For Apollo to succeed, he would need not just divine strength, but also cunning, wisdom, and an unshakable faith in the righteousness of his cause. As Apollo's resolve to challenge Python crystallized, the young god began to prepare for what would be the defining battle of his early divine career. This preparation involved not just honing his existing skills, but also acquiring new powers and tools that would be necessary to face a creature of Python's magnitude. First and foremost, Apollo needed weapons worthy of such a monumental task. The arrows he had crafted during his youth, while impressive, would not be sufficient against a creature whose scales were said to be harder than the bronze shields of mortal warriors. Therefore, Apollo sought out the divine smiths of Olympus, the Cyclopes who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts. The Cyclopes, impressed by Apollo's determination and recognizing the righteousness of his cause, agreed to help. They worked for 7 days and 7 nights, their hammers ringing against divine metals while the fires of their forges burned with colors that had no names in mortal languages. The result was a bow unlike any that had ever existed, crafted from a single piece of celestial silver and strung with threads of starlight itself. But even more impressive were the arrows they created. Each one was a masterwork of divine craftsmanship, their shafts carved from the wood of the world tree, and their points forged from metals that existed only in the heart of dying stars. These arrows could pierce any armor, fly faster than thought itself, and would never miss their intended target as long as the archer's cause was just. Additionally, Apollo knew that he would need more than just weapons to face Python. The serpent's greatest strength lay not just in its physical power, but in its ability to corrupt and mislead. Therefore, Apollo spent long hours studying with the Muses, learning the ancient arts of truth and clarity that would protect him from Python's mental attacks. The 9 Muses, each masters of different arts and sciences, taught Apollo how to maintain perfect focus even in the midst of chaos. They showed him how to see through illusions, how to recognize truth even when it was wrapped in layers of deception, and how to project his own divine light as a shield against corruption. Furthermore, Apollo sought the blessing of his father, Zeus. The king of the gods had initially been reluctant to become involved in what he saw as a young god's quest for glory. However, as reports of Python's growing influence reached Olympus, Zeus began to understand that this battle was about more than just personal ambition. "My son," Zeus said during their private meeting, "Python represents the old chaos that existed before we brought order to the world. If it is allowed to continue growing in power, it could threaten the very foundations of our rule. You have my blessing, and more than that, you have my protection." Zeus then bestowed upon Apollo a portion of his own divine authority, granting him the power to speak with the voice of absolute truth. This would prove crucial in the battle ahead, as it would allow Apollo to counter Python's lies and prophecies with declarations that carried the weight of cosmic law. Apollo's preparations also included gathering intelligence about his enemy. He sent out divine messengers, ravens, and wolves who could travel unseen through the mortal world to observe Python and report back on the serpent's habits and weaknesses. Through these scouts, Apollo learned valuable information about Python's daily routines, its preferred hunting grounds, and most importantly, the times when it was most vulnerable. Moreover, Apollo discovered that Python's power waxed and waned with certain celestial alignments. The serpent was strongest during the new moon, when darkness reigned supreme, but its power diminished during the full moon, when Apollo's own solar nature was at its peak. This knowledge would prove crucial in timing the attack. The young god also prepared himself spiritually for the battle ahead. He spent days in meditation and prayer, purifying his mind and body for the confrontation. He fasted and performed sacred rituals, aligning himself with the forces of order and justice that he would need to call upon during the battle. During this time, Apollo also received visits from various gods and goddesses who offered their support. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, provided tactical advice on how to approach a creature of Python's size and power. Hermes, the messenger god, offered his assistance in ensuring that Apollo could move quickly and strike from unexpected angles. Even some of the more neutral deities began to take sides in the coming conflict. The sea god Poseidon, initially indifferent to what he saw as a land-based conflict, eventually agreed to ensure that no water sources would aid Python during the battle. This was significant, as Python had been known to use floods and poisoned rivers as weapons against its enemies. As the time for the confrontation approached, Apollo's preparations became more intense and focused. He practiced his archery not just for accuracy, but for the specific challenges that Python would present. He learned to adjust for the serpent's enormous size, to predict its movements, and to find the vulnerable spots between its massive scales. The young god also prepared contingency plans for various scenarios. He knew that Python would not face him in honorable combat, but would instead use every trick and deception at its disposal. Therefore, Apollo prepared for ambushes, for illusions, and for the possibility that Python might try to use innocent mortals as shields or hostages. Finally, Apollo gathered a small group of allies who would accompany him on the journey to Delphi. These included several minor deities who had been personally affected by Python's reign of terror, as well as a few mortal heroes who had sworn to help in the battle against the serpent. While Apollo knew that the final confrontation would be his alone, he valued the support and companionship of those who shared his vision of a world free from Python's influence. With his preparations complete, Apollo set out from Delos on what would become one of the most famous journeys in all of Greek mythology. The young god did not travel alone. He was accompanied by a small but dedicated group of allies, and the very elements themselves seemed to respond to his divine presence. As Apollo's boat left the shores of Delos, the sun itself seemed to shine more brightly, as if celebrating the beginning of this epic quest. The sea, normally choppy and unpredictable in those waters, became calm and smooth, allowing the divine vessel to cut through the waves with supernatural speed. Dolphins raced alongside the boat, their joyful leaping a stark contrast to the serious nature of the mission. The journey from Delos to the mainland of Greece gave Apollo time to reflect on the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. Python had ruled Delphi for centuries, and many heroes had tried and failed to defeat it. What made him think he could succeed where so many others had failed? Yet every time doubt crept into his mind, Apollo remembered the stories of Python's cruelties and the corruption of the sacred oracle, and his resolve strengthened. Furthermore, as they traveled, Apollo began to notice the extent of Python's influence on the surrounding lands. Islands that should have been lush and green were barren and lifeless. The water in some areas had an unnatural color and smell that spoke of corruption and poison. Even the weather seemed affected. Storms would appear, suddenly and without warning, as if the very atmosphere was responding to the serpent's malevolent presence. When they reached the mainland, Apollo and his companions began the overland journey to Delphi. This part of the trip proved even more revealing about the scope of Python's reign of terror. Villages that had once thrived were now abandoned, their people having fled to safer regions. The few settlements they encountered were populated by frightened, desperate people who spoke in whispers about the horrors they had witnessed. In one such village, Apollo met an old priestess who had once served at a small temple near Delphi. She had managed to escape when Python's influence first began to spread, but the experience had left her deeply scarred. "Young god," she said, somehow recognizing Apollo's divine nature despite his mortal disguise, "you cannot imagine the corruption that has taken hold of that sacred place. The very ground bleeds with the poison of that creature's presence." Apollo listened carefully to her words, gathering intelligence about what he would face at Delphi. The priestess described how Python had corrupted not just the oracle, but the entire sacred complex. The temples had been transformed into twisted mockeries of their former selves, and the sacred springs that had once provided pure water for ritual purification now ran black with corruption. But perhaps most terrifying of all, the priestess continued, is how Python has corrupted the very concept of prophecy itself. Where once the oracle provided guidance and hope, now it offers only despair and manipulation. The serpent uses the sacred site to weave a web of false prophecies designed to increase its power and spread its influence. This information only strengthened Apollo's determination to reclaim Delphi. He realized that this battle was about more than just defeating a monster. It was about restoring the sacred nature of prophecy and ensuring that divine wisdom could once again flow freely to those who needed it. As they continued their journey, Apollo began to feel the weight of Python's presence even from a distance. The closer they got to Delphi, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The sun seemed to shine less brightly, and strange shadows moved across the landscape, even when there were no clouds in the sky. Moreover, Apollo's divine senses began to pick up the psychic emanations of the serpent's power. Python's thoughts were like a dark whisper at the edge of consciousness, promising power to those who would serve it and threatening destruction to those who opposed it. The young god had to concentrate to maintain his mental shields against this constant assault. The wildlife in the region also reflected Python's influence. Where once deer and rabbits might have grazed peacefully, now only scavengers and predators remained. The birds that flew overhead were species that fed on carrion and decay, and their cries had an unnatural quality that set everyone's nerves on edge. As they approached the final stretch of their journey, Apollo's companions began to show signs of the strain. Even the minor deities among them were affected by Python's oppressive presence, and the mortal heroes required constant encouragement to continue forward. Apollo realized that as they got closer to Delphi, he would need to take on more and more of the burden himself. Nevertheless, there were also signs that gave Apollo hope. Despite Python's corruption, some elements of the natural world still responded to his divine presence. Flowers would bloom in his footsteps, even in the most blighted areas, and clean springs would sometimes appear along their path, providing pure water in a land where most sources had been poisoned. These small miracles reminded Apollo that his power was not just about destruction and battle, but about healing and restoration. When he defeated Python, he would not just be removing a threat. He would be bringing life and hope back to a region that had suffered under the serpent's rule for far too long. The night before they were to reach Delphi, Apollo called his companions together for a final council. He knew that the next day would bring the confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of one of the most sacred sites in the Greek world. Tomorrow, he told them, we will face a creature that has terrorized this land for centuries. Python is not just a monster. It is a force of primordial chaos that seeks to corrupt everything it touches. But we carry with us something more powerful than any weapon. We carry the light of justice and the promise of a better future. His words seemed to strengthen the resolve of his companions, but Apollo knew that ultimately this would be his battle to fight. The confrontation with Python would test every aspect of his divine nature and determine whether he was truly worthy of the domains he had claimed at birth. As they made camp that final night, Apollo spent long hours in meditation and prayer, preparing his mind and spirit for the battle ahead. In the distance, he could see the glow of unnatural fires that marked the location of the corrupted Delphi, and he could feel Python's presence like a weight on his soul. But rather than feeling fear, Apollo felt a growing sense of anticipation. Tomorrow would bring the battle that would define his place in the pantheon of gods and establish his claim to one of the most important oracles in the world. The young god closed his eyes and dreamed of a Delphi restored to its former glory, with pure prophecies flowing from its sacred springs and pilgrims from across the world coming to seek divine guidance. Dawn broke gray and ominous as Apollo, in a way. His companions crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley that had once been called the most beautiful place in all of Greece. What they saw below them was a landscape transformed by corruption and malevolent power, a stark reminder of the magnitude of the task that lay ahead. The Valley of Delphi had been twisted into something that seemed to belong more to the underworld than to the realm of the living. Where once olive groves and sacred gardens had flourished, now only twisted, blackened trees remained, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers of accusation. The sacred springs that had once run clear and pure now bubbled, with a dark, viscous liquid that gave off vapors that made the air itself seem thick and oppressive. At the center of this scene of desolation stood the temple complex that had once housed the famous oracle of Delphi. The buildings had been physically transformed by Python's presence. Their white marble columns were now stained black with corruption, and strange, unnatural growths covered the walls like a cancer. The entire complex seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that made even the gods in Apollo's party feel uneasy, but it was the chasm at the heart of the complex that truly revealed the extent of Python's corruption. The sacred fissure from which the prophetic vapors had once risen now yawned like a wound in the earth itself, and from its depths came not the sweet-scented gases that had inspired divine visions, but a noxious miasma that seemed to carry whispers of madness and despair. Around the edges of the chasm, coiled in lazy loops that could have encircled small mountains, lay Python itself. Even from a distance, Apollo could see that the ancient descriptions had not exaggerated the serpent's size. Its body stretched for what seemed like miles, each scale as large as a warrior's shield and gleaming with an oily, iridescent sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The serpent's head, raised high above the chasm, was a masterpiece of terrifying design. Its eyes burned with an inner fire that spoke of intelligence and malice in equal measure, and its forked tongue flickered out to taste the air, somehow sensing the presence of the divine party despite the distance between them. When Python opened its mouth as if testing its voice for the battle to come, the sound that emerged was not quite a hiss and not quite a roar, but something that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and strike fear directly into the soul. Furthermore, Apollo could see that Python was not alone in its lair. The corrupted temple complex was inhabited by a host of lesser monsters and dark spirits that served the great serpent. These creatures scuttled and crawled through the ruins, their forms shifting and changing as if they were made more of shadow than substance. Some appeared to be failed experiments in creating life. Others seemed to be mortals who had been transformed by prolonged exposure to Python's corrupting influence. The sight of these horrors filled Apollo's companions with dread, and several of the mortal heroes began to question whether they had the strength to face such overwhelming evil. Even the minor deities seemed shaken by the scope of the corruption they witnessed. It was clear that Python had spent centuries building its power base and surrounding itself with layers of protection. However, rather than being discouraged by what he saw, Apollo felt his divine nature responding with righteous anger. The corruption of this sacred place was an affront to everything he represented: truth, beauty, harmony, and justice. The very existence of such a twisted mockery of divine order strengthened his resolve and focused his power in ways that his earlier preparations had not quite achieved. "Behold," Apollo said to his companions, his voice carrying a note of divine authority that had not been there before, "the result of allowing chaos to go unchecked. This is what happens when corruption is allowed to take root in sacred places. But today, we restore the balance. Today, we bring light back to this place of darkness." As Apollo spoke, his divine radiance began to shine more brightly, and the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on them during their approach seemed to lift slightly. His companions found their courage returning as they remembered that they served not just any god, but one whose very nature was opposed to the corruption they faced. Nevertheless, the task ahead remained daunting. Python had clearly sensed their arrival, and the great serpent was beginning to stir from its lazy coils around the chasm. Its movements sent tremors through the ground, and the lesser monsters throughout the complex began to screech and howl in anticipation of battle. Apollo knew that the time for stealth and careful planning had passed. Python would not be caught off guard, and there was no point in attempting to approach the serpent with subtlety. This would be a direct confrontation between two opposing forces, the young god of light and truth against the ancient serpent of darkness and deception. "My friends," Apollo said, turning to address his companions one final time, You have traveled far and risked much to stand with me at this moment. But from here, I must go forward alone. This battle is not just about defeating a monster. It is about proving that the new order of justice and harmony can triumph over the old chaos. That proof must come from my own strength and righteousness. Some of his companions protested, wanting to fight beside him, but Apollo's decision was final. He understood that this confrontation had to be between him and Python alone, without the complications that might arise from having others involved. The victory had to be clean and absolute, leaving no doubt about who had truly triumphed. Moreover, Apollo was concerned about the safety of his friends. Python's corruption was so intense that prolonged exposure to it could be dangerous even for divine beings. By facing the serpent alone, he would be protecting his companions from risks that they might not fully understand. As Apollo prepared to descend into the valley, he performed one final ritual of purification, calling upon all the powers of light and truth that he could command. His bow and arrows gleamed with divine radiance, and his very presence seemed to push back the darkness that had settled over the valley. The young god took his first steps down the slope toward the corrupted temple complex, and as he did so, Python's great head turned toward him with unmistakable recognition. The serpent's eyes blazed with renewed fury as it realized that the moment it had perhaps been anticipating for years had finally arrived. The battle between Apollo and Python was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of Delphi, but the balance of power between the forces of order and chaos in the ancient world. The stage was set for one of the most epic confrontations in all of mythology, and neither combatant would yield without a fight that would shake the very foundations of the earth. As Apollo descended into the valley of Delphi, the very air seemed to thicken with tension and anticipation. Each step he took caused the corrupted ground beneath his feet to smoke and hiss, as if his divine purity was burning away the taint that had accumulated over centuries of Python's occupation. The young god's radiance grew brighter with each passing moment, until he seemed to carry his own personal sunrise with him into the heart of darkness. Python, meanwhile, had fully awakened from its lazy coils around the sacred chasm. The great serpent raised its massive head high into the air, its neck extending upward like a living tower of scaled flesh. From this vantage point, it could look down upon the approaching god with eyes that burned with the accumulated malice and cunning of countless centuries. The first exchange between the two combatants was not physical, but mental. Python, true to its nature as a creature of deception and corruption, attempted to assault Apollo's mind with visions of despair and hopelessness. The serpent projected images of failed heroes who had tried to challenge it in the past. Their bones now scattered throughout the temple complex as a warning to future challengers. Young godling, Python's voice resonated, not through the air, but directly into Apollo's consciousness. Do you truly believe that your brief existence gives you the power to challenge one who has ruled this sacred place since before your father drew his first breath? I have seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations. I have witnessed the birth and death of gods. What makes you think you are different from all the others who have fallen before me? However, Apollo's response came, not in words but in action. Drawing his divine bow, he knocked one of the celestial arrows that the Cyclopes had crafted for him. The arrow gleamed with such brilliant light that it seemed to contain a piece of the sun itself. And as Apollo drew back the bowstring, the very air around him began to shimmer with heat and energy. "And I am different," Apollo replied, his voice carrying across the valley with the authority of absolute truth. "Because I do not fight for glory or conquest, I fight to restore what has been corrupted, to bring light to places that have been consumed by darkness. Your reign ends today, Ancient One, not because I am stronger than those who came before, but because justice itself demands it." With these words, Apollo released his first arrow, and the projectile streaked across the valley like a falling star. The arrow struck Python's massive flank with tremendous force, penetrating the supposedly impenetrable scales and drawing divine ichor, the golden blood of immortal beings. Python's roar of pain and rage shook the very mountains, causing rock slides in the distant peaks and sending flocks of terrified birds fleeing from the valley. Yet, rather than weakening Python, this first wound seemed to galvanize the ancient serpent into action. The creature's massive coils unwound from around the chasm with surprising speed, and its tail lashed out toward Apollo with the force of a battering ram. The young god barely managed to leap aside, his divine reflexes allowing him to avoid what would have been a crushing blow. As Python's tail struck the ground where Apollo had been standing, the earth split open with a tremendous crack, creating a chasm nearly as deep as the sacred fissure itself. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the entire valley, and several of the corrupted temple buildings collapsed into rubble. Undeterred by this display of raw power, Apollo continued his assault, firing arrow after arrow at his massive opponent. Each shot was perfectly aimed, seeking out the vulnerable spots between Python's scales or targeting the serpent's eyes and mouth. The divine arrows struck with the force of thunderbolts, each one carving channels of golden light through the creature's dark flesh. But Python was far from defenseless. The ancient serpent had not survived for centuries by relying solely on its physical power. As Apollo's arrows found their mark, Python began to weave a web of illusion and deception around the battlefield. The very air began to shimmer and distort, making it difficult for Apollo to judge distances accurately. Furthermore, Python began to call upon the dark spirits and lesser monsters that served it. These creatures emerged from the shadows of the ruined temple complex, their forms shifting and changing as they approached the battle. Some took the shape of fallen heroes trying to distract Apollo with the faces of those who had died challenging Python in the past. Others appeared as loved ones attempting to make the young god hesitate in his attack. Nevertheless, Apollo's divine nature protected him from the worst of these deceptions. His connection to truth and light allowed him to see through the illusions, and his righteous anger burned away the false images that Python projected. Each time the serpent tried to confuse or mislead him, Apollo's response was swift and decisive, another perfectly aimed arrow that found its mark despite all attempts at misdirection. The battle between Apollo and Python quickly escalated beyond anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. As the young god's arrows continued to find their mark, Python's rage grew to cosmic proportions. The serpent's roars of pain and fury echoed across the Greek mainland, causing earthquakes that were felt as far away as Athens and Sparta. Realizing that conventional tactics would not be enough to defeat this divine opponent, Python began to employ powers that it had held in reserve for centuries. The great serpent's eyes began to glow with an otherworldly fire, and from its mouth came not just poisonous breath, but streams of pure corruption that could wither anything they touched. Where these dark emanations struck the ground, the earth itself began to bubble and decay. Plants that had somehow survived Python's long occupation withered instantly, and even the stones of the ancient temple complex began to crumble and dissolve. The very air became thick and toxic, making it difficult for any living thing to breathe. Apollo, however, countered this assault with his own divine power. His radiance intensified until he seemed to be made of pure sunlight, and wherever his light touched, Python's corruption was burned away. The young god's presence began to purify the air itself, creating a bubble of clean, breathable atmosphere around him that expanded outward with each passing moment. "You cannot poison the light itself, Ancient One," Apollo declared, his voice ringing with divine authority. "Your darkness has held sway here for too long, but that ends now. I am the dawn that breaks the longest night, the truth that dispels the deepest lies. Python's response was to launch itself forward with surprising speed for such a massive creature. The serpent's body moved like liquid shadow, coiling and uncoiling as it sought to wrap itself around Apollo and crush him with its incredible strength. The young god found himself dancing between massive coils, his divine agility allowing him to stay just ahead of the serpent's crushing embrace. As Python's body thrashed and writhed, entire sections of the temple complex were destroyed. Ancient columns that had stood for millennia were reduced to rubble in seconds, and the ground itself began to crack and split under the tremendous forces at play. The sacred chasm at the center of the complex began to widen and deepen, as if the earth itself was responding to the titanic struggle taking place above it. Yet, despite the apparent chaos of the battle, Apollo maintained his focus and precision. Even while dodging Python's massive coils, he continued to fire his divine arrows with deadly accuracy. Each shot was calculated not just to wound, but to systematically weaken the serpent's ability to fight. The young god targeted Python's joints and pressure points, seeking to reduce the creature's mobility and strength. His arrows found their way between scales, piercing muscles and tendons with surgical precision. Slowly but surely, Python's movements began to slow, and its attacks became less coordinated. As the battle raged on, it became clear that despite Python's immense power and ancient cunning, the tide was turning in Apollo's favor. The young god's divine nature was proving stronger than the serpent's primordial chaos, and each exchange of attacks left Python weaker, while Apollo seemed to grow more radiant and powerful. The turning point came when Python, desperate to end the battle quickly, attempted to use its most dangerous weapon, the power of false prophecy. The serpent began to speak in the ancient tongue of oracles, weaving a web of lies and deceptions designed to confuse Apollo's divine senses and make him doubt his own purpose. "You fight for nothing, young god," Python hissed, its voice carrying the weight of false authority. "This place was never meant for you. The fates themselves have decreed that I shall rule here until the end of time. Your arrows may wound me, but they cannot change destiny itself." For a moment, the serpent's words seemed to carry an almost hypnotic power. The air around the battlefield shimmered with the weight of false prophecy, and even Apollo felt a moment of uncertainty. But then, deep within his divine essence, the young god felt the true voice of prophecy, the genuine power that he had been born to wield. "You speak of fate," Apollo replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But you know nothing of true prophecy. I have heard the real voice of destiny, and it speaks not of your eternal rule, but of your fall. The age of corruption ends today, and the age of truth begins." With these words, Apollo drew upon the deepest reserves of his divine power. His bow began to glow with such intensity that it seemed to be forged from solid light, and the arrow he nocked was unlike any he had fired before. This was not just a weapon, but a physical manifestation of divine justice itself. Python, sensing the change in Apollo's power, made one final desperate attempt to win the battle. The serpent reared up to its full height, towering above the temple, complex like a living mountain. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of fangs that dripped with poison potent enough to kill gods, and from its throat came a sound that was part roar, part hiss, and part the screaming of damned souls. The force of Python's final cry was so powerful that it shattered the remaining walls of the temple complex and sent shockwaves rippling across the landscape. Mountains trembled, rivers changed course, and the very sky seemed to darken in response to the serpent's rage. But Apollo stood firm against this assault, his divine light pushing back the darkness that Python tried to summon. The young god drew back his bowstring with deliberate precision, taking careful aim at the one spot that would end the battle once and for all, the point where Python's massive neck met its body, the location of the serpent's heart. By the authority of Zeus, by the justice of the fates, and by the light of truth itself, Apollo proclaimed, I banish you from this sacred place forever. Let your corruption end, and let purity return to these holy grounds. The arrow, when released, did not merely fly through the air. It streaked across the battlefield like a comet, trailing light and divine fire in its wake. Python, despite its size and power, could not dodge this final shot. The arrow struck true, piercing the serpent's heart with such force that it emerged from the other side of the massive body, carrying with it a spray of golden ichor that sparkled like stars in the morning light. Python's death cry was a sound that would echo through the ages, a wail of rage and despair that spoke of the end of an era. The great serpent's body convulsed once, twice, and then began to collapse in on itself. The life force that had sustained it for millennia finally extinguished as Python fell. Its massive form crashed to the ground with such force that it created a crater nearly as large as the sacred chasm itself. The impact sent tremors through the earth that were felt across the entire Greek world, and the sound of the serpent's fall was like thunder that rolled on for minutes without end. But something remarkable happened as Python's body struck the ground. Instead of simply lying there as a massive corpse, the serpent began to dissolve, its corrupted flesh melting away like shadow before the dawn. The golden ichor that flowed from its wounds began to purify the poisoned earth, and wherever it touched, new life immediately began to spring forth. Apollo watched in amazement as the transformation accelerated. Python's corruption, which had tainted the valley for centuries, was being burned away by the serpent's own divine blood. The blackened trees began to show signs of green life, the poisoned streams ran clear once more, and the very air seemed to lighten and sweeten. Furthermore, as Python's body continued to dissolve, the sacred chasm at the center of the temple complex began to change as well. The noxious vapors that had risen from its depths were replaced by sweet-scented gases that carried with them the true power of prophecy. The chasm itself seemed to grow brighter, as if lit by an inner fire that spoke of divine presence rather than corruption. Apollo approached the edge of the chasm and looked down into its depths. What he saw there filled him with wonder and reverence. The cavern below was not dark and threatening as it had been under Python's rule, but luminous with a soft golden light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the earth's heartbeat. This was the true oracle of Delphi, finally freed from the serpent's corrupting influence. As the young god stood at the edge of the sacred chasm, he felt a presence that was both ancient and eternal. The voice that spoke to him came not from any external source, but from the very depths of the earth itself, the voice of Gaia, the Earth Mother, speaking through her most sacred oracle. "Well done, Apollo, god of light and truth," the earth voice said, its tones carrying the weight of eons. "You have accomplished what many thought impossible. You have freed this sacred place from corruption and restored it to its true purpose. But with this victory comes responsibility. Will you accept the role of guardian of this oracle?" Apollo did not hesitate in his response. "I accept willingly, Earth Mother. I will ensure that this oracle serves truth and justice, that its prophecies guide rather than mislead, and that its sacred nature is preserved for all time." With these words, Apollo felt a new power flowing through him, not the raw energy of battle, but the subtle, profound authority of true prophecy. He was no longer just a young god seeking to prove himself, but the rightful guardian of one of the most important oracles in the world. In the days that followed Python's defeat, Apollo worked tirelessly to restore Delphi to its former glory. The young god's divine power proved remarkably effective at healing the damage that centuries of corruption had caused. Where Python's poison had killed the soil, Apollo's light brought new fertility. Where the serpent's presence had twisted the landscape, the god's harmony restored natural beauty. The temple complex, which had been reduced to ruins during the battle, was rebuilt with divine assistance. Apollo called upon the skills of the Cyclopes once more, but this time they crafted not weapons of war, but tools of peace and beauty. The new temples were more magnificent than anything that had stood there before, with columns of white marble that seemed to glow with inner light and chambers designed to amplify the voices of prophecy. Most importantly, Apollo established the proper rituals and procedures for consulting the oracle. No longer would the sacred chasm be used for manipulation and deception. Instead, it would serve as a conduit for genuine divine wisdom, providing guidance to mortals who sought it with pure hearts and honest intentions. Apollo also established the order of priestesses who would serve at the oracle. These women, known as the Pythia in honor of Apollo's victory over Python, would be chosen for their wisdom, purity, and ability to channel the prophetic vapors that rose from the sacred chasm. Under Apollo's guidance, they would deliver prophecies that were both true and beneficial, helping to guide the destinies of heroes and nations. The first Pythia was a young woman named Aristonoe, who had been among the refugees who fled the valley during Python's reign. She had maintained her faith in the possibility of restoration throughout the years of exile, and Apollo recognized in her the qualities that would make her an ideal servant of the oracle. Aristonoe, Apollo said as he formally invested her with the sacred role. You will be the first of many who will serve as the voice of truth at this oracle. Your words will carry the weight of divine wisdom, and through you, the gods will speak to mortals. Remember always that this is a sacred trust, and that the power you wield must be used only in service of justice and truth. Furthermore, Apollos established the Pythian Games, a festival that would be held every 4 years to commemorate his victory over Python and to honor the oracle. These games would include not just athletic competitions, but also contests of music, poetry, and drama, arts that were particularly dear to Apollo's heart. The first Pythian Games were attended by representatives from across the Greek world, and they served to announce to all that Delphi had been restored to its rightful place as a center of divine wisdom and cultural achievement. Heroes and kings came to participate in the competitions, but more importantly, they came to consult the oracle and receive guidance from the gods. The victory over Python marked a crucial transformation in Apollo's development as a deity. The young god who had set out from Delos to prove himself had returned as a mature divine figure with a clear understanding of his role in the cosmic order. The battle had tested not just his physical abilities, but his wisdom, his commitment to justice, and his capacity for leadership. Apollo's domains expanded significantly as a result of his victory. While he had always been associated with music, poetry, and prophecy, his defeat of Python established him as a god of purification and healing as well. The light that had burned away Python's corruption could also cleanse mortals of their sins and heal their spiritual wounds. Moreover, Apollo's role as guardian of the Delphic oracle made him one of the most important gods in the Greek pantheon. The oracle's prophecies would guide the decisions of heroes and rulers for centuries to come, and through it, Apollo would have a direct influence on the course of human history. The young god also developed a deeper understanding of the balance between order and chaos that governed the universe. His victory over Python was not just a triumph of good over evil, but a demonstration of how the forces of harmony and justice could triumph over corruption and deception when they were guided by wisdom and righteousness. This understanding would serve Apollo well in his future adventures and challenges. He would face other monsters and threats in the years to come, but he would approach them with the wisdom and confidence that came from his victory over Python. He had proven that he was worthy of his place among the Olympian gods, and that his light could shine even in the darkest places. The story of Apollo's victory over Python became one of the most celebrated myths in Greek culture, and its influence extended far beyond the realm of mere storytelling. The battle came to represent the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between truth and deception, and between the new order of justice and the old chaos of primordial forces. The Oracle of Delphi, purified and restored by Apollo's victory, became the most important religious site in the ancient Greek world. For over 1,000 years, pilgrims would travel from across the Mediterranean to consult the Pythia and receive guidance from the gods. The oracle's prophecies would influence the decisions of great leaders, the founding of cities, and the outcomes of wars. The temple complex at Delphi became a showcase of Greek art and architecture, with magnificent buildings and sculptures that celebrated both Apollo's victory and the cultural achievements of the Greek people. The site also became a center of learning and philosophical inquiry, where scholars would gather to discuss the deepest questions of existence and meaning. The Pythian Games, established by Apollo to commemorate his victory, became one of the 4 great Panhellenic festivals of the ancient world, alongside the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, and the Isthmian Games. These competitions brought together athletes, artists, and intellectuals from across the Greek world, fostering a sense of shared cultural identity and common purpose. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Apollo's victory over Python became a source of inspiration for countless generations of Greeks. It demonstrated that even the most ancient and powerful forces of darkness could be overcome by courage, righteousness, and divine assistance. It showed that the young could triumph over the old when they fought for justice and truth. The myth also established important themes that would resonate throughout Greek culture. The idea that prophecy should serve truth rather than deception, that sacred places should be protected from corruption, and that the gods were actively involved in maintaining cosmic order, all of these concepts were reinforced by the story of Apollo's battle with Python. As centuries passed, the story of Apollo's victory over Python continued to inspire new generations of storytellers, artists, and philosophers. The myth was retold in countless poems, plays, and works of art, each interpretation adding new layers of meaning and significance to the original tale. The Roman poet Ovid included the story in his Metamorphoses, emphasizing the transformative power of Apollo's victory and its role in establishing the god's authority over prophecy and music. Later, Christian writers would see in the story a prefiguration of the triumph of divine light over the forces of evil and corruption. Renaissance artists were particularly drawn to the dramatic visual possibilities of the story. Painters like Raphael and Poussin created masterful depictions of the battle, showing Apollo as a figure of divine beauty and power facing off against the monstrous Python. These works helped to establish the myth as one of the most recognizable stories from classical antiquity. The influence of the story extended beyond the arts into philosophy and religion as well. The Oracle of Delphi's famous inscription, "Know thyself," became a cornerstone of Greek philosophical thought, and the site continued to be revered as a place where divine wisdom could be accessed by those who approached it with proper reverence and humility. Even in modern times, the story of Apollo's victory over Python continues to resonate with audiences around the world. It speaks to universal themes of the struggle between good and evil, the importance of standing up to corruption and injustice, and the power of truth to overcome even the most entrenched deceptions. The myth also serves as a reminder of the responsibilities that come with power and authority. Apollo's victory over Python was not just a personal triumph, but the beginning of a sacred trust. As guardian of the Oracle of Delphi, He had to ensure that the site served the cause of justice and truth, rather than personal gain or political manipulation. As our tale draws to a close, we see Apollo standing at the restored Oracle of Delphi, the sacred chasm now glowing with pure divine light, instead of the corruption that had once poisoned it. The young god who had left Delos seeking to prove himself had returned as one of the most important deities in the Greek pantheon, the guardian of truth and prophecy. The Valley of Delphi, once a place of terror and despair, had been transformed into a beacon of hope and wisdom. Pilgrims from across the ancient world would come to seek guidance from the oracle, and the prophecies they received would be true and beneficial rather than manipulative and destructive. Python's reign of terror had ended, but the serpent's defeat represented more than just the fall of a single monster. It marked the triumph of the new order of gods over the old chaos of primordial forces. It showed that corruption and deception, no matter how ancient and powerful, could be overcome by courage, righteousness, and divine justice. Apollo's victory also established important principles that would guide the relationship between gods and mortals for centuries to come. The idea that divine power should be used to help rather than harm, that prophecy should guide rather than mislead, and that sacred places should be protected from corruption. All of these concepts were embodied in the story of the young god's triumph over the ancient serpent. The tale of Apollo's battle with Python reminds us that the struggle between light and darkness, between truth and deception, is eternal and ongoing. In every generation, new champions must rise to face the forces of corruption and chaos. The story provides both inspiration and guidance for those who would take up this sacred duty. As we conclude this epic tale, we are reminded that the light of truth, once kindled, can never be fully extinguished. Apollo's victory over Python was not just a moment of triumph, but the beginning of an eternal flame that would burn bright in the hearts of all who value justice, wisdom, and the divine spark that connects us to the sacred mysteries of existence. Oracle of Delphi stands as eternal testament to the power of that light and to the courage of a young god who dared to challenge the darkness and bring hope to a world that desperately needed it. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all, that no matter how powerful the forces of corruption may seem, they cannot withstand the combined power of truth, justice, and divine purpose. The legend of Apollo's victory over Python continues to inspire us today, reminding us that each of us has the potential to be a bearer of light in a world that sometimes seems consumed by darkness. We may not possess divine arrows or immortal strength, but we carry within us the same spark of truth and justice that guided Apollo to victory so many millennia ago. And so the story ends where it began, with light triumphant over darkness, truth victorious over deception, and hope restored to those who had lost it. The Oracle of Delphi speaks once more with the voice of divine wisdom, and the world is a better place because one young god had the courage to stand against the ancient forces of corruption and chaos. Thus concludes the tale of Apollo's victory over Python, a story that has echoed through the ages and continues to inspire all who hear it. May its light shine forever in the hearts of those who love truth and justice, and may its wisdom guide us through our own battles against the forces of darkness that threaten our world